for it. So abstraction to the highest level, but precision chart to take a photograph is for the things which are there, and tested the theory with the various things. This is Brahmajinalaya and Lakkundi. Scan the model, cut into slices, and then just with these two lines when I created it, there was a very small little detail like a something like a 4 mm projection. But I thought it is, I don't know, how can somebody be so religious in terms of following an instrument? It was part of the program, that you follow it, it comes into it. But if you make it so programmatic, the artisan will never happiness. So there is a lot of freedom for them, but you don't only change these two lines. They are very generative in principle. So I just looked into a larger group of temples, large scale temples. The whole temple could be reduced into 6 or 7 instructions. I mean, whenever I go to this kind of a small villages and ask for, this particular old temple, they, very important temple, they will take me to the most latest modern concrete one. I said, no, don't show me this one. Show me the one which is done by Jagannathacharya. There is a very legendary architect or Sthapati whose name was Jagannathacharya. So the villager will take you to the outskirts, and on the way he will tell the story that the whole temple was done in one night. Whole idea was generated overnight and created overnight. Created overnight or not, but the idea of that creating in overnight really fascinated me, because that's what most of my students do it. Last day of the submission they somehow created. So I said, okay, this is something which I am very much interested. How do they create overnight and everything? Such a masterpiece. So then it is, the legend is true. So that is a kind of thing. So these were all some of the examples that I am trying to show, that one is a generative model using certain kind of a principle. The other one is superimposing with this kind of a mesh which I saw it. So there was a stark similarity. How much time I have now? How much time I have? Done already. Okay, fine, I will try to wind it. So similarly, tried it out with a variety of other kind of geometries, stellar geometries. I would say that the entire thing could be, a trend I may reduce the whole data into some of these numbers and figures. If we can tell the whole thing, but then there is a huge scholarship which is required to take it forward and develop it. All these kind of areas that we really looked into it, well, it was quite interesting. Some of them were in dire conditions. This was one temple which was being used as a cattle shed in one small little remote village of Budol area. I found that was one of the greatest masterpieces anybody could, take it forward in this kind of a stellar geometries today. It was not only from outside of the star, each segment is a star, and when it is projected outwards, it was also a star. And then I was wondering that there was one small reference in the text which talks about this temple, which is never found it. It's only, I don't know how long it is going to last. Somebody has already implemented it very carefully and very precisely. So these are the things which I would say that generative logic, I will not go into the details, how you can do it. So, sometimes the whole logic is that you start from the top to bottom. So that was the time I started using drones. My students started giving a nickname of Drone Acharya after some time, because I was more into trying to get a roof plans. Because if anybody says that they have really understood roof plan, I think it's very difficult. It is very conscious way of playing, and then you have to take it to the last line. So these were the kind of analytics when we got it. This is Taranga near the border of Rajasthan and Gujarat, a giant temple, which was, we really had a very interesting understanding of it, various things. Now, coming to text, whether they can be embodied into it. This is something of interesting for you. This whole design could be told in these 4 lines. Yes, it is possible. We had to demonstrate it. Airaviteshwar temple. By then, I think our jigyasa greed it was expanded. More than 1,200 temples we started doing whatever the means. Whether we can down approach, aerial approach. We used to hire a machine for 15 days per lidar, but then start using it. What was supposed to be for 5 temples could expand to 50 days. We know where to take the measurements, where the key areas to do it. Some understanding of surveying, some understanding of technology, some of ways of your scientific ways of doing it. start writing some little plugins for those missing areas. So that helps a lot. So Airavacheshwara text what it says and this is what it is. They may not follow the exact text. There is a lot of freedom for this, but then in principle, if you know those 4 lines, if you can read these 4 lines, and then you can extrapolate the information. So they tested various things. Another Movur temple area, maybe. I think Maniarsan also must have seen this place. Movur whole thing can be done in it. Horizontal is 23 parts, vertical is 44 parts. And each pada, upada, when this thing. So entire thing can be deconstructed, but each of you can do it in your own way. I can show you how it can be done. The whole deciphering of some of this, roof plans started coming, evolving, realizing, these things. These are Professor Adam Hardy's, analysis of some of my works which I started collecting it. This might be, this is just Tulna temple in Asoda in Rajasthan. So when you start seeing these things, you know certain ways of how these ideas must have emerged, evolved. I would not use the word evolve. It is, it's more like from seed to how a tree evolves. These are the ideas were always there. Somebody needed an opportunity to demonstrate. It looks like that. So these were the collective thoughts which were there. So some of the things were, now slowly started making some sense. But now, question last aspect of it: can you regenerate these ideas with this group of students? I took first year students of mine, who had no idea about a temple or anything. Deduce the whole idea. This is the base work which we did. From a shloka we know how to cut it, a circle into 20 parts. That we did it. Of course, modern using CAD also we did that one. Derived the whole this thing from the scan data. Entire information was embedded into one small little Purushranga. One little small example was done. This was done. I 3D printed this model and gave it to 20 different students. Each one was told that do not change the upper line, do not change the lower line. This is your reference. You do anything in between. Some rules were told. So like that, so these kids started making them. The thing is that I still hold the key. There are key lines which I say that you can't change it, but then you can do certain kind of path and profile part of it. So like this, the students started doing it recently when we did a small little exhibition about temple architecture. This was the details. So next part was reproduction of it. So you need a lot more number of people. You need 100 people to produce them. So these 7 kids who have developed the smaller segments with a certain kind of very clear instructions where it has to stop, and that's how it is. So finally then we started assembling all those units. This is what it resulted into. We could recreate the 28-sided temple of Udeshwar with absolutely no idea about temple architecture. Today when I explain it to them, they understand things much better. When I take them to the site, they see a pattern, they recognize a pattern. They understand that this is not, this could have been like that, this could have been like that, this should have. So it gave a certain kind of a confidence to me that we haven't lost that knowledge system. So we still have to somewhere find a key to crack those things and do this once. Even if it is at a micro level scale detailing, whether it's using a clay or whatever it is. And then that's how the whole thing was. So I'll end with that one. So that, as I told you, this is not exactly recreating a temple or anything. It was a time to regain the perhaps possible ways of regaining a knowledge which was lost it out. You need technology to understand your basic level of technology, which seems to be far more sophisticated. You need a very high-end system today to recreate this thing. But somebody could do it in 5 lines, 6 lines with a few instructions with a shloka. So if you want to really call it codified architecture, well, I do see an example. When you really want to generative architecture, I do see an example. When you want to really talk about it, particular parametric architecture, these are the names that we have recently found. But then if you go back to the knowledge systems, I'm sure there is a lot more. Beyond this point, of course, this is only one building or one particular way of looking at it. My area of interest was to look at these things as a cultural resources. These are the economic institutions. These were all the kind of a way of organizing cities, organizing settlements and various knowledge systems which are there. From that background, I came to a little physical, one small level of a thing, how one, if you understand one thing in detail, how it may lead to a larger understanding. Thank you very much.
I request Principal Meera Maligaonkar, Professor Brinda Gokhale and Associate Professor Shruti Bowankar to come on the stage for the felicitation. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Now we have Professor Michael Batty, who will be joining us through an online platform. He is a renowned urban planning expert. Professor Michael Batty holds the Bartlett Professorship at University College London and chairs the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis. With groundbreaking research spanning over 5 decades, he explores computer models of cities and digital urban transformation. Author of influential works such as Cities and Complexity and The New Science of Cities. His forthcoming book, The Computable City, delves into the evolution of urban landscapes through technology. Professor Batty's illustrious career includes prestigious appointments and accolades, cementing his global influence in academia. As the editor for Environment and Planning B since 1982, he continues to shape discourse. He was elected as a Fellow of the Chinese Geographical Society in 2022 and foreign member of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 2023. So we are ready for your speech.
Hello, hello. Hello.
Mike, we cannot hear.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Can you please start?
Yes, well, we can hear you now.
You can hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, right, okay, that's good. Right, well, let me
Thank
start
you.
the PowerPoint again. Okay, let's have a look here. Let me stop sharing and let me just stop sharing for a moment. Can you still hear me? Still hear me? Yes, let's share it again. PowerPoint share. Okay, can you hear me at the moment? Can you hear me?
Yes, Mike, we can.
Okay, very good. Can you see my screen? Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about the problem, really, but I think we're okay now. Please tell me, interrupt me, and tell me if there's any problems as we go along. Okay, so what I was saying is that after I've introduced myself, I'm Mike Batty from University College London. I'm going to talk about inventing future cities. I'm going to spend about 20 minutes talking about ways of thinking about the future cities, in particular the shape of future cities in this context. So I've called the talk Inventing Future Cities, and what I'm going to talk about is a number of different topics. I'm going to begin by defining cities. So these are the list of things I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes. I want to talk about defining cities. Where do we draw the boundary? Where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the boundary? Now, this is particularly resonant, I think, with very large city systems, megalopolis, large-scale metropolis, or megacities such as in the Mumbai region. In that sense, it's true also of very large cities in the West, for example, and I'll give you an example of London in a moment, my own city in that context. So, in other words, dependent upon how we think about the future city, we really need to define the size and shape of cities in that sense. So that's what I'm going to begin with. The shape of cities is often referred to as their morphology. And there are two major forces in the development of cities, and these two major forces have played against each other for probably hundreds of years, and certainly since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution about 250 years ago. The forces of centralization and decentralization, the pull and push forces really that relate to cities are all important in terms of their shape. And of course, centralisation and decentralisation is intimately connected to transportation in some senses. And as we change the mode of transportation, we change the balance of how centralised and how decentralised activities are in cities. So I'll be talking about that for about the next 5 minutes or so, and then I'll talk a little bit about the pandemic. I know that in the conference you're thinking about the future city post-pandemic in some sense, and I'll talk about the impact of the pandemic on the contemporary city, and in particular the impact on British cities. I'll talk about things like working from home and living at lower densities. These are very resonant with what's happening in terms of cities in the West, for example, in that sense, that if you look at my own city, London, for example, generally speaking, during the working week, only about 60 or 70% of people have really come back to the office in that sense. And certainly on the early parts of the week, Mondays and on Fridays, the end of the week, really only about 40% of people are back in offices in that sense. So a very large number of people, in fact, are working from home using technologies such as the one that we're using at the moment, that I'm using at the moment, such as Zoom and Teams and Google Meet and all of these new technologies that enable us to communicate. That's really very important, and it has an important impact on transportation, and I'll come back to that later. And then, having said something about the pandemic, I'm going to talk about some experiments. How can we predict these trends? How can we build some simple models, some hypothetical models, ideal types, if you like, to look at what cities might look like in the future? And this, again, will play on the balance between centralisation and decentralisation. So let me begin by talking about defining future cities. Where do we draw the line? Where do we draw the boundary in that sense? Now, cities are very hard to define because they merge, if you like, into their wider hinterland. Certainly big cities are hard to define in that sense because many small cities become absorbed. They fuse in with the big city in this particular context. This is particularly resonant of cities that have grown more slowly, basically, in this particular context. So, for example, London, over the last 300 years or so, has absorbed many small towns and villages into the fabric, basically, in that sense. And we would refer to them, to some extent, as being polycentric, basically, in that sense. And as their size changes, as cities get bigger, their density changes, and people begin to move differently. So big cities we would define, certainly in this context, as being greater than about 3 million population. Small towns, for example, would be of the order of about 50,000, basically. And if we take somewhere like London or Toronto or Mumbai, any of these big cities, then it's difficult to draw the boundary, basically, and different boundaries are drawn. So, for example, many of the statistics you would see for something like London, for example, would be the administrative unit, the Greater London Authority, which in fact is the smallest part of London. The Greater London Authority does not include most of the London airports, basically, in some sense. It includes Heathrow, but the Greater London Authority has about 9 million people. If you go to a website such as Wikipedia and key in Greater London or London, then it will give you a statistic of around 9 million people. That's basically the Greater London Authority. We really need to add what's called the outer metropolitan area, and then the size will go up to about 15 million. If we then add the surrounding areas, for example, Oxford and Cambridge are sort of on the edge of London. Oxford and Cambridge are about 40 miles away from the centre of London, basically, Brighton and so on the south coast, then the population goes up to about 20 million. So, to some extent, to compare like with like, we really need to take the bigger figure, basically, in this particular context. So it's important to actually define the city, and of course, as we change the definition, then the nature of the city begins to change. If we look at downtown Mumbai, for example, that's very different, I think, from the wider region, basically, and I'll show you a picture of this that I got from a website in a moment, basically. So let me look at some city shapes and say something about them. Cities tend to be circular. There is normally some central point in most big cities, basically. The central point, which is the centre of settlement, which essentially is the central market. I mean, cities exist because people come together to actually trade and exchange. The whole purpose of cities is to bring people together in the production process, to share their labour and to exchange the goods that they produce in this particular context. And this generically is what cities are all about, in a sense. Cities are really the factories, if you like, of the industrial and service revolution. They're basically places which generate innovations, inventions, production and consumption and so on. And in that sense, and bringing people together in close proximity is absolutely essential to realise the economies of scale, these agglomeration economies. Now, what you can see here are three pictures of megacities, basically. On the left, you see London, basically. And when I talked a moment ago about London being about 9 million people, then that's the inner part, basically, the red and the dark blue, in that sense, and the London metropolitan region. I said that from this particular data source, which is the global human settlements layer, population density layer produced by the European Commission, it's a particularly good data set worldwide because it has quite fine scale different population densities. You can see London, basically, and you can also see it spreading out. You can see how polycentric or polynucleated the city is in that sense, with small towns being absorbed as it's grown. The middle picture is the Pearl River Delta. That's the Greater Bay Area, which includes Hong Kong. Hong Kong is basically on the south and the east, basically, in that sense. You can just about make it out. Hong Kong is very small in comparison to the Greater Bay Area. North of Hong Kong, north of the New Territories, very close to Hong Kong itself, is of course Shenzhen, which has reached about 21 million itself. Hong Kong is about 8 million. And then, of course, all the way sweeping round to Guangzhou and the Macau and Zhuhai and so on. Then you have this very big city region of something in the order of something like 60 million people. Now, on the immediate right, the picture on the right is of the Low Countries, the Netherlands, where in fact many cities have been to. The Netherlands, basically, and you can see Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and so on. So that's the picture on the immediate right. Let me move on and say something about idealized cities. I mean, what we've seen previously at this point is how cities have actually grown. Of course, in architecture and planning, there's a very important dimension to thinking about ideal cities, basically. And here are two of the great architect planners of the past, basically. Frank Lloyd Wright on the left, who specialised in thinking about different shapes and sizes of cities, and then Le Corbusier on the immediate right. On the immediate left, you can see a tall spire. Basically, this is Frank Lloyd Wright's mile-high town called the Illinois Building, which he proposed in 1957, I think. And that's a picture of Frank Lloyd Wright and his other great scheme for the future city, which is the highly decentralized broadacre city, which is a city of suburbs in that sense, a city of very low density. So you see immediately a very high-rise city on the left, which is very similar, in fact, to his mile-high tower. It's very similar to the Burj Khalifa, I think, in Dubai, the big tall tower in Dubai, which is up to about almost a kilometre high, I think, in that sense. And then you can see the low-density sprawl. And then on the immediate right, you can see a picture of Corbusier. That's called, basically, looking at his model for central Paris, basically, which was a proposal to increase the density of living in central Paris in this particular context. So you can see extreme examples of low density on the left and high density on the right, basically. Okay, now let me say something very briefly. I'm not going to give you a lecture today in terms of how cities form and how they evolve, basically. There are many theories of this, but I need to say something a little bit about the fact that we do have a strong sense of urban science and city science dealing with how cities actually grow and evolve. These are quite formal theories, not very dissimilar from economic theories in some sense in that way. And indeed, if you go back 200 years or so, the gentleman on the left, for example, is Johann von Thunen, basically. Now, von Thunen basically was a German farmer, basically, who produced a theory of cities which still is very resonant with how we think of cities today. The picture on the immediate right of von Thunen, if you look at the screen then, the circular picture, is his model, if you like, of the ideal city, or rather his model of how cities would actually evolve in practice. And indeed, you can see the central marketplace in that city, and you can see the concentric rings, you can see the bands of different land uses. Of course, von Thunen talked about an agricultural market rather than an urban market. He wrote his famous book in 1801, 1800, so that's 220 years ago, basically. But basically, that he produced an economic model that suggested that the industries and the services and activities that could bid best to be near the centre of the market would, in fact, dominate. And so, for example, you would get market gardens and high-quality produce in the agricultural context being near the market, and much lower density agricultural products, farming and dairying and so on, away from the market. And this particular model was developed in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century, the model was regenerated and applied to cities. William Alonso who was at Harvard basically at the time, basically wrote his thesis basically on location and land use, applying the von Thunen model to contemporary cities. And if you look at contemporary cities, you can see this banding everywhere. You can see the circularity, and you can see the radial transport routes that cut into this radiality, this concentric zones, basically, in this particular context. In von Thunen's case, his circular city, basically, is punctuated by a river, which links to the centre. In that sense, you can see what looks like a little tadpole, basically, in terms of the way the single route of the river actually cuts through the arrangement of concentric rings. Now, the two other pictures are London again, and you can see, I've shown you this more or less already, but there are several pictures in this talk of London in this context. You can see here, the red through to green is the relative accessibility or nearness, basically. You can more or less make out the centre of London. That's looking east-west, that's looking west towards east or east-west, basically, to London. That's the city with about 10, 12 million, something of that sort. You can see the street network, basically. And then on the immediate right, you can actually see the city zoned into what are effectively small administrative units, basically, in that sense. And you can see, in both cases, we're looking really at the density, basically. We're looking at the density, the sprawl, the concentric rings, and the radial structure of the city in that sense. Okay, now here are some other urban forms, which are many idealized cities. We've seen Frank Lloyd Wright, and we've seen Le Corbusier, basically in terms of their thinking about cities. There are lots of other cities. These are pictures mainly on the left are linear cities. On the immediate left, which I've got as B and D, I've picked those from a paper. This is Brasilia, which is a linear structure of some sort. This is the capital of the new capital of Brazil, basically, in that sense, which was founded in the 1950s. Basically, you can see that the wing-like shape. This was the inspiration for the circular form. If you go to Brasilia now, then you find that the city, in fact, that the wing-like shape, of course, is still there to some extent, but the city has grown enormously in a much more bottom-up way. In fact, cities are very rarely planned from the top down. They grow from the bottom up. Indeed, many of the ideas that we've developed in our group and other people around the world really use complexity science. They argue that cities are complex systems. They're not planned from the top down. They're not manufactured in any sense from the top down like a machine. They're more like an organism. They're more like a biological system that grows really from the bottom up. And if we impose an order on the town, such as in the context of Brasilia, then what we will probably find is that unless we control it very strictly and in great detail, unless we control the form basically by some kind of authority, then it will gradually revert really to a kind of a bottom-up. So the wing-like structure will ultimately begin to look like, and it's already looking like in the case of Brasilia, a naturally evolving town, such as the ones that we've already seen, such as London and the Greater Bay Area and so on. Now the other pictures are all linear cities. You can see the contrast between the linear city basically along a line, and in the middle of the picture there, in the middle of the picture you can probably just make out a line across the aerial photograph basically, or the remotely sensed image. This is NEOM. This is the proposal in Saudi Arabia to build a linear city of 150 kilometers long basically, and to build that around a high-speed rail link, a hyperloop of some sort. And then you can see other pictures basically, which I'm not going to go into in detail, but other pictures of linear cities. On the immediate right, we see a very different contrast. This is Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, the Garden City of tomorrow, basically, produced as the idealization of what cities should be like at the end of the 19th century. And you can see that to some extent, Howard has accepted the fact that big cities, ideal cities to some extent, should have this circular radial shape, basically, the concentric and radial shape. And what he's suggesting there is that the city itself, the central city, is decentralized into polycentres, basically, which in fact were enacted in Britain in terms of the London New Towns, basically. So that's a good model, if you like, of what actually happened between about 1950 and about 1980, 1990. In the development of the London New Towns, basically, in that sense. So you can see lots of different shapes, each having different advantages with respect to density, with respect to travel, and so on, in that sense. Again, I'm going to make the point, and you've seen this already, and I won't labour it, but cities evolve from the bottom up. No one plans them, or at least the amount of planning is very small. They can be explained by this new science of complexity, which really looks at how all the parts are arranged and how they fit together, how transportation relates in that sense, and they scale and grow in different ways. As they get bigger, as cities get bigger, they change qualitatively. An excellent example of that is that you do not find subways and transit systems in cities that are really less than about 3 million people. There are probably one or two exceptional examples, but generally speaking, probably China is the place to look at in terms of transit systems, because once cities reach 3 or 4 million, basically, then they can afford a transit system, basically. So they change qualitatively as they grow, and they change in terms of realizing greater economies of scale, agglomeration economies as they grow in this context. So here are pictures of different renditions of London, again implying this morphology of the concentric radial system in that sense. Okay, now this is a little bit nearer to home, basically, in your context. So this is Mumbai. I've taken this from the Global Human Settlements layer. It's a website basically that gives you the density of these things, and you can see a picture of India, or northern India basically, with Mumbai basically on the left in that sense, and the red through to blue represents population densities. You can see your capital city Delhi there, and also Mumbai, the two big cities in that particular frame in this particular context. And then I've zoomed in on Mumbai itself. I mean, Mumbai is a very complex system in some sense, and of course in a way I guess you're sitting in the very tip of this at the moment somewhere in downtown Mumbai. The Mumbai region is enormous. Now, I've been to Mumbai a couple of times in the past. It's a long time, basically, since I was there, basically, in a sense. And it must have grown enormously even since I was there about 25 years ago. That sense, you can actually see the little inset, which is the growth of Mumbai over the last probably about 25 years or so in that particular context, taken from satellite imagery, taken from remotely sensed images in that sense. And you can see that in some senses, Mumbai, or the Mumbai region, Greater Mumbai, departs from this ideal shape. If you look back at these pictures here, for example, where we've got the classic concentric radial growth in a sense, and at this particular scale, Mumbai looks nothing like that in a sense. It's very much dominated by the physical terrain in some senses, although if we begin to drill down and begin to look at the detail, and I've not been able to do this from this particular database, it doesn't quite pick up that sort of detail, but were we to do that, then we do begin to see the concentric radial system of the typical city basically beginning to reassert itself in that sense. But this is it's a good website to look at. I'm not giving you the website, but if you go to Google or any search engine and key in global human settlements layer, the Joint Research Council in the European Community, basically, then they have constructed this database worldwide. So in other words, you can actually produce data, you can get data, you can certainly get pictures immediately on the screen, but you can also get the data, basically, looking at these different densities. Okay, so let me say something about the pandemic. Let me just have a quick look and see how we're doing for time. Okay, so I make it 6:53 my time, so it's going to be 20 past 12, I guess, your time, something like that. Okay, so let me carry on. I'm very, very conscious about timing here. It's a little bit difficult, of course, to get it right in this kind of remote context, basically. But let me talk about the second thing that I wanted to talk about, which was the pandemic and its impact on the contemporary city. Now, of course, densities get lower as cities grow, basically. As we, generally speaking, get more and more residential and various kinds of economic activity around the centre as it grows, and as our technologies get better as cities grow. Generally speaking, as cities have grown from their original seeds through to their sizes now, this is classic in terms of London, Mumbai and so on, then clearly the technologies begin to change. And many things begin to change in a sense, and particularly how people move and the way they move changes in that sense. So in other words, because the pandemic basically is a disease that traditionally is spread by it's spread by droplets basically in some sense, and it's spread probably by contact on surfaces and to a lesser extent contact between individuals. Nevertheless, the whole question of nearness, how near you are to the disease in some sense, whether the disease is being communicated or transferred by person to person, or whether it's from one surface to another. In that context, the closer you are, basically, in some sense, the greater the probability that you will actually contract the disease. So one of the kind of key issues that emerged when the pandemic emerged in early 2020, basically, originally in Wuhan in China, and then quite quickly spread to the West, basically, in that sense. The West, in fact, probably had a greater percentage of persons were infected early on in the pandemic, rather than Asia had greater control to some extent at the beginning. Nevertheless, the contact was one of the kind of strategies to deal with the contact was basically social distancing in a sense. And of course, as cities got bigger and denser, basically, in a sense, then the probability of contact is really greater in that sense. We can normalise all of that. If we normalise all of this by density, then we probably find that the rate of contact is no different in big cities from small cities. But because more and more people are packed into big cities at higher densities towards the centre, then it would appear that the big cities would be more likely to contract the disease, basically, in this particular context. So where we work and how we travel is really all important in this particular context. And in the context of Britain, for example, when it was realised that the pandemic, as indeed happened worldwide, in March and April 2020, when it realised that the pandemic was spreading quite dramatically in terms of its speed and so on, 80% of the population were advised by government to work from home, and only 20% of the population, the so-called essential workers, were allowed to actually move around. So were you to have visited any British cities in March, April 2020, then you would find them almost like ghost towns, basically, in a sense, because most people would begin to work from home. It's amazing that we have these technologies of Zoom and Teams and all these technologies to enable us to communicate, basically. Of course, we had Skype, and many people were using Skype at that particular point, but Zoom and Teams and all of these online technologies grew dramatically during the beginning of the pandemic, so that people could begin to communicate in this way. It would be an interesting question to know what the pandemic would have been like had we not had these technologies such as Zoom. That's a sort of counterfactual, it's a sort of thought experiment, but it's the sort of thing we need to think about when we think about future cities. What are the counterfactuals? What could cities have looked like if things had been different, basically? So part and parcel of thinking about the future city is to think about these differences in the sense. Let me look at some examples of what happened during these 2 or 3 years during the pandemic in the context of London, basically. And what we've got in this particular graph is the old. We've got a graph which on the horizontal axis we have the number of days from when the pandemic was resumed to begin, and that was in the context of the UK. The 5th of February 2020, that was pretty true of most places basically around the world. But February 2020 is the sort of official date of the beginning, 5th of February 2020. And that's the date from the start of the pandemic, and these statistics run across the horizontal axis in terms of the number of days from the start, basically. So it's taking up to 900 days, which is not far short of 3 years, really, from 2020 to 2023, basically, at that particular point. What you can actually see on the vertical axis is the drop in transit. This is a transit graph. This is the number of people travelling, basically, on the vertical axis. And you can see that we've got the old normal. That if there hadn't been a pandemic, then the old normal baseline would be the baseline where people were travelling in the normal way. And what you can see immediately the pandemic began, a massive drop, if you like, in the number of travellers. There are indeed, I've not actually labelled it on this particular map, in fact, but there are 3 different baselines in that sense, which relate to different areas of Britain. Now the blue baseline is the people using transit, basically. This is all transit, it's all subway traffic, basically, rail traffic, I should say. And this is the blue line at the bottom is basically in central London, basically. So you can see a massive drop in transit, in the patronage of transit, so used to the tube and subway, basically, from something like the old baseline all the way down to something like 90%. A drop of 90%, only 10% of traditional back in the middle of 2020, and then a gradual recovery. The spiky nature relates to the fact that these statistics relate to days of the week. In some sense, there is some variation still in the days of the week. But you can see the gradual recovery in 2021, and then the drop again in early 2021, basically, and then a growth. And then these are, in fact, predictions to this graph is not updated largely because this comes from the Apple mobility and the Google mobility trends, basically, database, which was more or less finished, in fact, or not available after about 2022, basically. You can see the predictions. I should say that the orange figure here is London itself. So the blue figure is central London, okay, high density population. The orange figure, orange or red, whatever you want to call it, is London itself, and the grey basically is England, basically, in that sense. So you can see a big difference between the high density of London, which is and the lower density of other parts of Britain, basically, in that sense. And this is, you can see the recovery from due to vaccinations, social distancing and mask wearing and so on, which is forecast, in fact, and you can see that the City of London is the last one to recover. In fact, were I to actually plot these graphs now, then the City of London and London in general and the UK have not really recovered to pre-pandemic levels. We're still talking about a small number of, a fairly significant number, I should say, of individuals not patronising transit any longer and moving away and changing their behaviour. So to some extent, the pandemic has had a long-term effect, which I don't show in this graph, but it's a long-term effect in terms of the fact that people have not returned to work, a certain percentage basically in that sense, and this is beginning to change the nature of transportation and change the nature of office building and so on in big cities in that sense. So I think that we're going to see a long-term impact, and this of course is confounded by the fact that many of these new technologies to communicate have been advancing quite rapidly at the same sort of time. Okay, now these are pictures that you can get. What I've got here is this is a picture over a 3-year period. Again, time on the horizontal axis, and the reported excess deaths, which is in red, and the official COVID deaths, basically in grey. And you can see that the reported deaths, excess deaths, and the actual official deaths, in the case of Britain on the left, are reasonably close, but not completely close. You can see a significant difference, basically. You can see the two peaks back in 2020 and then 2021 and so on, and then the slow recovery. I've actually taken the Indian statistics, so it's a massive difference. We're talking about, what, 1.3, 1.4 billion people in India and something like 66 million in UK, in Britain. Basically a massive difference in a sense, so they're not really comparable in that sense, but you can see the estimated reported deaths in the case of India on the immediate right in a sense, and it's much greater, but it's followed the same sort of trend basically in that sense. These are deaths per 100,000 population. Now these statistics are taken from The Economist. If you go to The Economist magazine, go online, they're all open access. You can actually pick those statistics out and make comparisons between any two countries around the world, basically, in that sense, to show what the differences are. The differences are not very, there are some differences in size, basically, but in terms of the actual profiles, they're fairly similar, basically. They show you, in the case of India, that the pandemic is a little bit lagged behind what would have occurred in Western Europe in the United States and in terms of Britain. And these are global estimated deaths and official deaths, basically, quite a big difference. In Asia, a big difference between official and estimated. Africa, well, poor data in Africa, basically, Europe too, basically. So you can see some big differences in this particular context. And these can be traced to government policy, they can be traced to a whole range of different things that really relate to how people actually handle the pandemic in that sense. Okay, right, some experiments. What can we do to predict these trends? What we've been doing in our group in London is building some hypothetical models of how we can think about the future of cities. Now, of course, our view would be that, generally speaking, excuse me, generally speaking, the future of anything is highly unpredictable, basically. We can't really predict the future. We can begin to guess what the future is like in this particular context, but we can't really predict it. That would be magic, were we to be able to predict the future in that sense. And that goes, of course, for ourselves in planning cities. We can't predict the future. What can we actually say? What we can actually do is develop an informed debate about what the future might be. We can think of many different futures and use these to think about different sorts of scenarios in that sense. How things change over time, basically, in this particular context. Now, to some extent, predicting the future is all about qualitative change, basically, in that sense. We don't really have a good theory of change in this particular context, but we can say something about how the big forces that determine what cities look like, in particular centralisation and decentralisation, how they begin to interact in unusual ways and produce strange outcomes. And to some extent, some of these strange outcomes are resonant in terms of the way the pandemic has worked itself out. So working from home is a relatively strange outcome relative to how civilizations have grown over the last 200 or 300 years. It may not be a particularly strange outcome if you look at a pre-technological society where a lot of people did work from home, basically, in a sense, pre-industrial revolution. It's only the industrialization that has led people to actually move to factories and so on. So to some extent, working from home is not new when we look at it over literally hundreds of perhaps thousands of years in that sense, but it's very different in terms of what has happened over the last 200 years. Also, we have this phenomenon called the death of distance. The distance is increasingly less important in terms of the way we organise things, basically, in that sense. So these are two features, I think, that really relate to thinking about what future cities will be like. We can look at the death of public transport relative to other forms of transport, because clearly in big cities, more people are likely to be travelling by public transport. Basically, about 90% of the people travelling into central London, into the city and Westminster, about 2 million people work in downtown London. The number of people travelling by public transport is very high, and it's only when we get into the suburbs that people are travelling by car, basically, in that sense, more by car. I think about 40% of people, 30 to 35% of people travel by car in Greater London, in the metropolis, and about 60%, 55% are travelling by various forms of public transport, railway and bus, basically, and about 14% are travelling by what we call active travel these days, which is bike or walking, basically. At any point in central London, about 40% of the workers are actually walking, certainly during peak hour, in a sense, to different modes of transport. And so, in some senses, all of these are important issues in terms of thinking about the future city. Should also say about social distancing. Social distancing certainly appears to have disappeared since the pandemic sort of went into abeyance or ended, if you like, in that sense. Although an increasing number of people want to live in suburban locations in the country, and there are new forms of contact emerging in this particular context in terms of the way people are working and the time they spend in different locations of work in that sense. Okay, so let me begin by just showing you some of these pictures, and then I'll begin to tail off and make a few conclusions. What we've been doing is building a kind of an ideal type in that sense, beginning with a kind of grid of points. Let's think of this as a city. So on the immediate left, you've got these are locations in the city. This is our grid city. You could think of this as Broadacre City, or you could think of it indeed as Corbusier's plan for Paris. Those two pictures I showed you earlier on. And then next to it, on the left, basically, not the immediate left, but the next left, basically, with the little arrows on, you can make out these little arrows. Then basically what we've done is to build an ideal city where people are moving to the centre. Everybody is working in the centre and living in these different locations. And as you move away from the central point, central grid, then the density of population reduces. And then you can see the activity, the density of population on those two pictures on the right. Now what we do with this model is we distort it. We actually change the travel that's implicit. That's a very simple model where everybody is travelling to the centre from these different points, basically. And what we can then begin to do is to move people around in terms of where they work. We can get people, instead of working in the centre, to work at home. And we can look at the change in transit patterns and the change in the shape of the city that occurs. Now we can do lots of things in this to actually distort the picture, basically, but this is our ideal type. This is, if you like, this is the things we can use to actually explore different patterns in terms of the future. And now don't worry about these things at the bottom of there, basically, you can forget those basically, but what we've done, you see, is to introduce structure, and the top line actually shows some examples, basically. It shows an example on the left of increasing the centrality or the polycentrality of the polycentricity, basically, of the ideal type. And then on the immediate right, basically, you can see how we actually spread activity to the edges. So we've changed the nature of the location of jobs and where people work on the left-hand side in terms of the existing city, and then on the right-hand side, not the immediate right, but the next door to the immediate right, we've got a picture where we've moved people to the edge of the city. So, in other words, we've got very different forms of city, and what we want to do is we want to work out what the travel patterns are like, and ultimately we want the city to grow, as it were, and I'll show you in a moment how we can grow this, basically, grow these patterns, basically, in a sense, to actually look at what the city might look like in this particular context. These are top-down imposed patterns that we've done, but I'll show you in a moment how we can actually grow the city in this particular context. Now, here in fact is transplanting this ideal type to Greater London. So that's a picture of Greater London. There's about 15 million people in that area. That's London and the outer metropolitan area that does not contain Oxford and Cambridge. That's outside the area, but it's about it's probably about 16 million in that area. What we've done is to put our grid onto the picture, basically, in that sense. And what we now begin to do is to actually change the shape of things by changing how people travel, basically, in that sense. Change the shape of the city. And that gives us our different types, our different city types, basically, in that sense. So there's the picture of London. The mid-grey figure is the Greater London Authority, basically. That's the 9 million, basically. And the whole of that is the 16 million or so. And here you can see, and I'm not going to go through these in detail, here you can actually see different shapes of cities that we've done. And if you can think of this as being a kind of a little bit like a petri dish, I suppose, in some sense, where we have a city and we begin to change the elements of it and watch it grow, and you can see on the top right, top right, you can see that everybody is clustered in the center, basically, and there are different variants of this as we go around, basically. Now, here, for example, we have different pictures. These are all different ways of tuning, if you like, the travel patterns and the working from home, basically, in this particular context. You can see that there again we have the concentration in the centre, basically, and then we're beginning to get concentration along the edge, in the periphery, basically. So the two pictures on the right-hand side show you two extremes. I'll make them even more extreme, and the next picture, in fact, shows orientation where we really reinforce decentralization, and the reinforcement of decentralization pushes people either to the left or the right. This depends on the nature of quite how we arrange the jobs in that sense, but you can see that as we fashion these things in different ways, we can get different structures. And of course, I've not gone into this, but out of this, of course, are lots of different statistics that tell us, what it is like to travel, to live and work and travel in these different city forms. And to some extent... Yes? I'm really for...
Yeah. You're running a little time in hard to conclude.
Yeah, I've nearly finished, okay. In fact, okay, next steps, okay, so let me finish and just say the unpredictability of the future city is important. The form can appear the same, but everything can be different within it. That's one very important issue that, although we look at these forms in a sense, what's actually inside them is important. The idea of the vertical city, the idea of the Dubai city, basically, in a sense, is important. And transportation systems and active travel are all important. Now, the other thing I've not talked about, but I'm sure will be talked about briefly in this conference, I know it's in the conference notes, are the grand challenges that relate to this: climate change, ageing, geopolitical tension, and so on. And the idea of what happens to all of these things when cities begin to fuse. Now, at that point, I want to stop. I'll just point you in the direction of my book from 2018 called Inventing Future Cities. Have a look at that. And then a couple of other books that we've got. An informatics book that is online by Springer, basically. That's a much more technical book, basically. And my New Science of Cities book tells you about the theory of how we do all of this sort of stuff in that sense. So at that point, apologies for going on a bit. I hope it's not actually wrecked your lunchtime or anything like that. But thank you again for inviting me. And I'll stop at that point.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we'll have a short break of 10 minutes and then we'll resume with the pedagogy session. Everyone, all the participants are requested to be back in the auditorium in 10 minutes. Thank you.
कैमरा रहने देता, बंद नहीं कर, कैमरा बंद नहीं कर, बैटरी ऊपर ही हाँ रख दो
Great.
Yeah, the
next session is not for another 3 or 4 hours, isn't it?
Yes. 5 p.m. IST.
I'm having difficulty hearing you, I'm afraid.
I'll just text you.
I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing.
Good afternoon, everybody. We'll be starting with the pedagogy session, which is our second session for the day shortly. We request the student council to please call the students and be seated. Thank you.
पोडियम पे अब वो लग रहा है।